It's great to welcome to the program today Guy Snodgrass, who's a retired American naval aviator who served as Jim Mattis's speechwriter and chief of communications. He is author of the new book, Holding the Line Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis. It's so great to have you on. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.
So what was your understanding of why President Trump chose Jim Mattis as his defense secretary to begin with?
Well, I think there's probably two reasons. I think the one and the most important one is that Jim Mattis has a great reputation throughout Washington and in uniform circles as well. As I understand it, and I have some friends who were on the transition team that actually helped President Trump. And then at that point, of course, President-elect Trump put together his forthcoming cabinet. And like I said, Mattis has a great reputation. He's beloved in military circles. He's known as not only a warrior, but a scholar. He's got recent relevant experience. So I think that was hopefully the most important reason. But we've heard the president himself say on numerous occasions he loves individuals who are straight from central casting. So to have someone who had been a recently retired general who kind of looks the part, acts the part, has a lot of pithy quotes and sayings that made him sound pretty terrific, I think is probably what really swayed the pendulum over.
Would it be fair to say, in your estimation, that it was not the position of Jim Mattis on any particular issue that was appealing to Trump?
I don't think that's the case. I think that, if you think about how President Trump has operated with what we've seen so far as you get into, year three of his presidency, like I said, he likes people straight from central casting. He likes people who are going to be unquestionably loyal to him. And so for Jim Mattis himself to have shared publicly, he said that when he went in and he had his interview for the role of Secretary of Defense with both President-elect Trump and President-elect Pence, that he had disagreed with the president on every single question he was asked. That's an inauspicious start for a role as one of the most senior members of Trump's cabinet. So I don't think there was certainly any of his positions per se, but I think that, again, he's got a great reputation and Trump liked what he saw.
What, in your mind, is it that made Mattis not the right fit for Trump in the end? As we saw, eventually it became very public. Presumably, this was noticeable privately before it became noticeable publicly, although maybe not. What was it that made them not actually as compatible as maybe would have worked better for them?
Well, I think it's interesting, even from my role working on Secretary Mattis's personal staff and anybody who's had that kind of a job before, you realize job number one is protect your boss. And that can mean a couple different things. It could mean that you help shield your boss from anything that might be untoward in the press, or you want to keep people who would be sycophants away from them. It also means protect your boss so that you temper some of their worst instincts, or if they want to lash out, they want to do something that wouldn't be in their best interest, you want to help shore them up and make sure that they don't inadvertently shoot themselves in the foot. And I think that's one thing that maybe President Trump didn't account for with Secretary Mattis was that, look, he's a retired four-star general. He's headstrong. He believes very deeply in doing the right thing. And so if President Trump had felt that Mattis would just blindly go where he pointed him, I think that's where that distance started to grow. And like I share in the book, as you get into the winter of 2018, the spring of 2018, when Tillerson and McMaster, Tillerson being then Secretary of State, and McMaster being the national security advisor at the time, when they both walk out, you knew that it was going to get pretty tough pretty quick.
The policy via tweet stuff. I mean, one story that has been relayed quite a bit related to that is, correct me if I'm wrong on the details, but I believe that Jim Mattis was out of the country and did not know that Donald Trump was going to be tweeting an announcement about removing transgender military service members, changing the policy around that. Talk a little bit about that and the more general idea of the policy by tweet. What was Jim Mattis' sense of that?
Well, so you're touching on a couple different things here. One, so to be clear, he wasn't out of the country. He was actually in Washington State. His then mother, who unfortunately has since passed away, but he was home visiting with his mother and spending, this is a guy who dedicates himself. He is in the office about 12 to 14 hours a day, rarely takes time off. And one of the first times he goes west of the Rockies to take some time off, and suddenly here comes this transgender ban. And it was tweeted, as you mentioned. So the thing that really was just so terrible about this from an organizational standpoint is that Mattis had kept Trump in the loop. He had kept Secretary Tillerson. He kept everyone who needed to be in the loop with regards to how they were going to, one, research what the right course of action would be, what his recommendations should be to the president per the president's request. And then the first time that it comes up, boom, it's a tweet, a series of three that just completely reverses U.S. policy. And more importantly, Mattis knew that that would not stand a legal defense. Instead of having it underpinned by hard facts and expert interviews, you just suddenly change everyone's policy, and it wasn't going to stand the test of time. And that was just one of many that I highlight as I recount the 2 years that Mattis had with President Trump. You had the no notice announcement of the Space Force creation. You had the no notice reversal of the United States going to cease all major military exercises with South Korea. And of course, that's in the paper again today. So that's one of the things that's been so fascinating is when you look at this 2 year experience that I capture into one book, people might say, okay, well, Mattis left at the end of 2018. We're 10 months beyond that. Things have changed. They haven't. A lot of these same issues are still coming up, whether it's the troops at the border, the current negotiations ongoing with North Korea, and of course, South Korea and Japan. It was also in the news this weekend where Japan was pushing back, and so was South Korea, about these significant increases in funding that President Trump wants out of them. So there's a lot of things that just continue to reverberate.
So in the 10 months since General Mattis left, are there specific policies that have been carried out that you believe would not have been were Jim Mattis still in his position?
That's a tough one, right? I mean, that's kind of revisionist history. There's a lot of speculation there. I do think, though, that you would have seen more pushback, and I don't mean pushback in that you would have a Secretary of Defense openly defy the president he serves. Look, Secretary Mattis is a politician. He took a political job in order to be a part of the Trump administration. So you can't step away from that. I think the concern, though, is that as you've seen how President Trump made a statement when he was the president-elect that he wanted to bring the best people into his administration, the best men and women he could find, the most talented. And I think we've all watched as a lot of those individuals who stood by their principles rather than blind loyalty suddenly got pushed aside. And so you better know, it's, in many cases, there's been a second or a third or even a fourth person. In fact, Secretary Esper, the current serving Secretary of Defense for the U.S. military, is the fourth guy to have that job. So for that to have occurred in such a rapid period of time, there's no doubt that he's going to be more pliable when it comes to fulfilling the president's agenda. And that includes what we've seen with sending troops to the border, to using military funding, which is crucial to rebuild America's military. It's crucial for putting ships to sea and tanks out in the field or for exercises, instead of using it to build a border wall, for example, on the border with Mexico.
Yeah, one of the things, I share what some on the left and some on the right have seen as sort of a renewed respect, in a sense, for some of the main people like Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and others who said, this is as far as we've come. I can't, in short, paraphrasing, I can't do this anymore. I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm out. But at the same time, Donald Trump has been a known entity for so long. I mean, the Trump we're seeing as president in the last year is the same Trump we saw as president in the first year, is the same Trump that we believed would be president in the transition period and during the campaign. Right. So at the same time, there's a question of what didn't they see at the time? What didn't Tillerson see, or what didn't Mattis see? Is it as easy as saying when the president asks you, you do it? But clearly that's not the case, because ultimately there was a limit to that. So that's where I sort of start to get confused. Why was anybody so surprised that this is the way it went?
I think that you could certainly say, and I don't think anybody needs to be forgiven per se. It's just a turn of phrase, but you could be forgiven for saying that when you have President-elect Trump, he is new on the political stage, relatively speaking. I mean, everyone knew he's a land developer from New York. People had seen, Trump steaks, Trump water, Taj Mahal. I mean, all these things he's done throughout his career. But I'm sure everyone had a little bit of a candle of hope that when he came into the office, he would be different. And he would listen to these men and women who are the experts who spent decades, and they've dedicated, in some cases, their entire adult lives to serving the nation, that Trump wouldn't be deferential per se, but that he would certainly adhere to, or he would want to know what their best thoughts were and how could he use that to inform his policy. And I don't think it went that way. And let's also be honest, these are men and women who are incredibly ambitious. This is their opportunity to make change, to have a positive influence on the direction of the nation, the direction of the departments they served. And I have no doubt Secretary Mattis absolutely wanted to be the Secretary of Defense, regardless of any concerns he had with President Trump, because it was his chance to help restore America's military. He cares deeply about the men and women who serve, and he felt he could do more good in the job than he would harm. And I think we saw that for about 2 years.
The book is, of course, super interesting, and you detail a lot of interesting discussions, which were actually the subject of some controversy, which I want to talk about. So, if I recall correctly, there was a period of about 4 months during which the book was in the hands of the Pentagon's censors, I guess we would call them. I don't know if there's a more appropriate or technical phrase for them. And you eventually sued the Pentagon, saying they were stalling the release of the book for no real good material reason. Oh,
Right.
tell us a little bit about that. What was the controversy around the book that stalled it?
Well, I think, let's start from the first principles, if you will. Every senior leader wants to determine their own destiny. They want to set the narrative for how they're perceived, and anybody junior to them who may want to tell their story is a little bit of a threat. And you can look back through history. Winston Churchill, I loved his quote, which went something along the lines of that he, after following World War II, he said that history would be kind to him because he intended to write most of it. And I thought that was a great way to put it. So Secretary Mattis, he had written a book about leadership that he published after he left as Secretary of Defense. And I have no doubt that as time goes forward, he's going to want to continue to set the narrative of what he accomplished and the great things that occurred under his watch. My problem with that is that a lot of times, just like, for example, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, you have Henry Kissinger's autobiographies, which paint one side of the coin. But then you have someone like Walter Isaacson, who's a noted scholar, who comes in behind and says, hang on a second, I'm going to do an independent look. I'm going to do a biography of Kissinger and share with you all of what it looked like behind the scenes, because there's a lot to learn there. And that's the approach I wanted to take with my book. So it was an apolitical approach. It was a chance to really take a look at the entire 2 years that Secretary Mattis had served for President Trump. And it's threatening to Secretary Mattis. He can't control that narrative, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. So the Pentagon sought to delay the book. They sought to block the book. And I think that they probably were just a little surprised that I decided to stick with the plan, or stick with the project, and go ahead and ultimately have to fight the Pentagon. And to your point, it was moving very swiftly until about the beginning of June. I mean, a month in, the White House had approved the manuscript. The State Department had approved the manuscript. Everyone external to the Pentagon was complete. And then suddenly, when Mattis's own book got submitted for review and got bogged down, then suddenly mine surprisingly got bogged down too. So that all culminated at the beginning of September, where I filed a suit, and the Department of Justice knew that it was going to be a losing case. Within a week, they had contacted me, said, "Hey, could you please drop the case? We're going to give you the book."
That's interesting. So you're there. So there were actually two things, but it sounds like maybe they're related, or at least you're suggesting they're related, which is it being held up in the sort of redaction or censorship phase by the Pentagon. But then, if I recall correctly, General Mattis had questioned whether you were the right person to be talking about what went on. But you believe maybe the things are related, in the sense that the reason that the censors started slowing it down was because Mattis had a book himself that he was working on.
Oh, I don't think there's much doubt there. I mean, Secretary Mattis, I kept him. Look, he's my former boss. I have a great deal of affection for him as someone who I respect deeply, who served the country very well. And I learned a ton during my year and a half with him in the Pentagon. But there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, in January of this year, I had contacted Secretary Mattis to let him know that I was going to embark on this project. Then as we reached the middle of March, I wanted to give him a heads up that we were going to announce the book project. And he immediately took that email that I sent him and forwarded it to the Pentagon to put the censors onto me. So, it's unfortunate. I think a lot of that stuff tends to play out behind the scenes. And in my case, I felt very passionate about this project and didn't feel that I should be bullied in stepping away from it. I thought and I still believe there's a lot of information in this book that is recent, relevant, and important for Americans to read about, like what really happens behind the scenes, what it's really like to be in the room with President Trump or Vice President Pence or Secretary Pompeo. Like, these are individuals, of course, who are still in their respective roles today. You can read for yourself what it's like to be in those meetings and make an educated judgment on whether you like the direction that we're going or you think there needs to be a change.
Yes, and many of those descriptions are fascinating to read. We've been talking with Guy Snodgrass, who is not just a retired American naval aviator who served as Jim Mattis' speechwriter and chief of communications. He also wrote the book Holding the Line: Inside Trump's Pentagon with Secretary Mattis. Guy, really appreciate your time and you telling us about not only the process, but about your time working with Jim Mattis. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having me.